And our next guest has done some really interesting work on both the politics of student debt in this country and specifically canceling student debt, all of it, and about the extent and nature and distribution of the student debt burden in this country. Sean McElwee is, among other things, the Chief Meme Officer of Data for Progress, or DFP. He is also a contributor to The Nation. He conducted this research for, and this is partially a disclosure on my part, he conducted this latest research on behalf of the student debt cancellation group Freedom to Prosper. I am an advisor to Freedom to Prosper, and by the time we go to air, an article co-authored by Sean and me should be published in The Nation talking about his findings. So with all of that, Sean, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, great to have you. And by the way, I'm going to embarrass you now by saying that I didn't know that you were named by Politico as one of the Politico 50 most influential political people of the year. So you're going to forget all your old friends now?
No, they will not let me forget it. So.
Oh, all right. Okay. Well, congratulations on that. Very well earned. And I think a big piece of that was your work on the whole idea of abolishing ICE, which we're all behind. So, but let's go back to student debt. So you and your colleagues at Data for Progress took a look at the distribution. Let's start with, first of all, the extent of student debt. You guys created a student debt index, and you know, I know some of the conversations and thinking that went into that, but why don't you tell our audience?
Sure. So we know a lot about the problem of student debt nationally. We know there are 40 million people who currently hold student debt. We know that those people are roughly a fifth of the electorate. But politics doesn't happen nationally, right? Politics happens at the state level. It happens at the congressional district level. So what we wanted to do was sort of take student debt cancellation and move it out of the economic case, which we think is very persuasive as made, and move it to the political case. And what we show is that across the country, congressional districts are deeply burdened by student debt. There are tens of thousands and even sometimes hundreds of thousands of student debt holders in these districts. And this is a drag on the economy. And also, it is a real potential to unleash political power. We show in the polling that we've done, people who hold student debt overwhelmingly support the idea of canceling it. They're also a group that leans more progressive, but they're also a group that is less excited about the upcoming elections and less excited to vote. And the reason is because for the last few decades, the Democratic Party has sadly pursued, very limited solutions to the problem. And the problem is massive. This is a $1 trillion problem, and we're pursuing solutions like, over 10 years, if you work in the right job and you pay the right amount every month, maybe we'll cancel it, but also maybe Trump will just turn around and say no. And so rather than sort of tackling this problem head on, we've tried to pursue these sort of small bore solutions that haven't persuaded voters that the Democratic Party actually cares about them and that they should vote for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and there's a lot there, and I want to unpack some of it. First of all, just to be sort of mildly anal, it's 44 million, right? I mean, that's the number I've heard. And 1.5 trillion in all outstanding debt. And it's a big deal because it's a huge sum of money, the largest unsecured debt in the country. I mean, the only thing bigger that I know of is mortgage debt, but that is secured by a house of value. So largest unsecured debt in the country, $1.5 trillion, 44 million people, plus their family and their friends and those people around them. And what you guys have done is basically taken this problem that's so huge that it may appear, nebulous, like a giant cloud of misery, and broken it down to the state and even the congressional district level, which is, are the quantum at which, politics happens, certainly national politics. And in doing that, you guys have found that, there's misery everywhere, basically, some less here and some there. But I thought your methodology for doing that was interesting, because you basically, to build an index of the level of student debt pain by district or state, you guys factored in not just the amount of student debt, but did so against, as I understand, the income level for that district or state, the racial composition of that district or state, because a lot of people don't understand how hard the student debt crisis hits communities of color, for example. So you basically weighed it all in and then created a scale. Maybe it's got 100 points on it, but basically goes from horrible to up to really horrible. Did I summarize that reasonably well?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there's no zero in the student debt burden index because there's no congressional district that doesn't have student debt burden. But what we try to do is we try to account for the fact that if you have a sort of upscale, high-income district with a lot of student debt, that is a problem. But it's a much larger problem if you have a district that has a low median income and a lot of student debt. And so the debt burden index factors in that. And it means that student debt does not affect the world the way a lot of people think it does. So we can walk through a couple truths on this. So student debt is not just a problem in California and New York. We actually find that it is a problem across the country. Student debt is not just a problem that affects high-income Goldman Sachs employees. In fact, about half of people who have student debt do not have a four-year bachelor's degree. They either have a trade degree, they have an associate's degree, they maybe took a couple college classes and dropped out. And those people have to pay back the debt without the sort of increase in income that one would expect to come from taking on that debt. Student debt burden also affects a lot of older folks. Many people who are responsible for paying off student debt accrued that debt decades ago. And in some cases, there are people who are literally getting Social Security that are having their Social Security garnished because they still owe the government debt. And this is cruel, and it's also needless. We own this debt, and we can cancel it. And if we cancel that debt, people will have money that they can spend creating jobs, they can spend starting their own business, they can spend buying things that other people have their jobs creating and selling. And so the economic impacts would actually be to grow the economy over the long term.
And I think one of the things that I think the economic impact is very great, because you have a lot of people, your findings address a lot of the objections that you hear, that, and certainly that I've heard, which are, well, those privileged rich white kids, you're giving them a break. The fact is, the numbers show that there are a lot of people, most people, in fact, if I understand correctly, don't fit, the stereotypical. First of all, if you're Donald Trump's kids, you don't have student debt because your daddy just wrote a check for your higher education. So the truly wealthy don't have student debt. The moderately wealthy may or may not, but they're a small percentage of the population. Then you get into, well, what would happen to medicine if doctors got their student debt forgiven? Well, maybe more of them would stay in primary care. Maybe more of them would go to rural locations where they can't make enough money currently to pay off their debt. Maybe fewer of them would go into high-cost specialties and that type of thing. And of course, with all of this, I'm speculating, but the point being this, and you alluded to it a minute ago, your research makes a good companion piece to the Levy Institute study that was done a few months back that showed that canceling all student debt, the macroeconomic impact of that would be to create more than 1 million jobs a year for several years, as well as to grow the economy overall. So we're actually, with our misconceptions about who student debt affects, we're actually paying a price for it. Everyone in the economy is, or most people are directly or indirectly paying a price for our refusal to cancel student debt. So you must really not want to do it if you want to lose more than 1 million jobs just on your misperception of who has student debt. That was a rant, but any thoughts on that?
Sure. And your anecdotes are what we're seeing constantly. So in the piece that we have coming out of The Nation, we talked to Carrie Eastman, and she says, I have a lot of friends who went to law school and they wanted to get jobs as defense attorneys. And when they saw the extent of the bills that they would have to pay, they said, well, I'll get my defense attorney job 5 years from now. I'll get my defense attorney job 6 years from now after I pay off my student debt. So there absolutely is a dimension to the fact that these high levels of student debt really do force people into doing work that is less socially beneficial. And there would definitely be ripple effects from that. And this gets at something else, which is the student debt crisis is now so large in magnitude that politicians are having to take it seriously. So there has been legislation actually introduced in Congress to cancel student debt. It has 19 co-sponsors. There are congressional candidates running on this, not just in deep blue districts. They're running on it in, red to blue districts. And they're even running on it in maybe reddish districts that are stretches to flip, because they're seeing how much pain it is inflicting on the voters of their district, and they know that they need to start addressing this problem. There's sort of this mythology that cancellation is somehow extreme, when, in my opinion, the fact that we have $1.5 trillion in debt that is sucking the lifeblood of our economy is the extreme position. And the sort of much less extreme position is we should get rid of that crisis and we should move forward, and we should sort of start creating an economy that works for everyone.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you mentioned both the moral and the political dimensions of this. You mentioned Cara Eastman, for example, who's running in Nebraska's 2nd district, and that's a district that could go either way. And she clearly feels this is an issue, a student debt that needs to be highlighted and discussed, and that bold thinking is needed. A number of candidates have said that about student debt, and I know that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has read the Levy Institute report and talked about it quite a bit. Other candidates are open to ideas like canceling student debt. I think what people forget, Sean McElwee, is that in previous generations, we didn't have this kind of student debt. This was not a fact of life for people, my age or older. I mean, there was jubilation in my family household when I got a Regents scholarship to the State University of New York, because it was going to save us $250, I think it was, a year in tuition. And now, inflation adjusted, or a semester. Inflation adjusted, that might be $1,500 a year now, but it's something like $12,000 a year. So we created this enormous group of people that has this burden. I think there will be tuition-free college education widely available in this country again someday soon. And I think then what do we do with these people who are carrying this $1.5 trillion? It sounds extreme, but it's not extreme, as you said, and it's not extreme politically either, is it?
No, absolutely not. We polled on the idea of canceling student debt, and we found majority support after you exclude the people who don't know, and more support than opposition. And we found that in the vast majority of states, net support was positive for the idea, even states that might surprise people. And I think that the reason for this is that the extent to which this student debt trap has been created by predatory institutions that do not have legitimacy with the general public the banking institutions, the for-profit colleges. People know that these institutions are predatory and they're preying on people, and they know that it's time for us to fight back. And what we've seen is with, Donald Trump and the Republican Party passing multi-trillion-dollar tax cuts into law, Democrats are saying, why can't we do that? Why can't we, throw it into the wind? And instead of throwing in caution to the wind to the benefit of the 1% and the bankers, let's throw caution to the wind in a way that actually helps the people who are struggling in this country. It's time for us to actually take radical action, because we are seeing a Republican Party that has created an economy that is so deeply based on predation that we cannot solve it with minor regulations. We can't solve it with means-tested programs. We actually need to just cut to the root of the problem when we have the power to do so.
It strikes me that this issue, Sean McElwee, resonates on so many different levels. First of all, I do want to reiterate how important it is to understand that politically, to these sort of pundits and politicians, that it may seem like an extreme idea. To the American people, based on your polling and your findings, already without any major politician or public figure or political party advocating for it, already kind of have plurality support for it, and that's without without a long-term concerted campaign and public figures advocating for it. So it's already got a bed of support, and not only and here I'll get it. This was obviously a nonpartisan research project, but if one wants to look at the partisan implications of it, just as you and I, sort of talking about the political implications of it, the people who support this idea the most are exactly the people that, for example, Democrats would want to reach and persuade and turn out to the polls. It's people of color, it's young people, it's people who aren't, as you said, not enthusiastic about voting in the next election. It has strong support in all those groups. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. I mean, we see polls every day where if you look at, you give people a 0 to 10 and you say 0 is you're not going to vote at all and 10 is you're certain to vote, where you place yourself. And they look at 9s and 10s, and 65 plus, they're all 9s and 10s. But 18 to 35, very few 9s and 10s. Why? Because we have policies that help 65-year-olds. We have policies that the government directly benefits them every day of their lives. We haven't done anything for young people in this country. The biggest problem with these sorts of long-term solutions is, Obama put into place a program that was going to cancel out your debt after 10 years if you do the right things. And Obama came in and said, no, we're not. It's over. It's done. And if we keep working on this time horizon and we sort of put our faith that the Republican Party will hold good on promises that Democrats are making, we're going to get in trouble every time. We're not going to get the results that we want to see. And so the very simple argument we're making is, if the Democratic Party wants young people to vote for them, the Democratic Party should do something for young people. Promise policies that help young people. And you're absolutely right. This is very popular with young people. This is very popular with student debt holders, who, by the way, make up 1 in every 5 voters. That's a huge pool of voters. It's very popular with people of color, and it's very popular with the very marginal voters that are going to decide these races. Nebraska's second is going to be decided by, do the people who like the Democratic Party but don't turn out all the time, maybe voted in 2012, maybe they're going to vote in 2020, but maybe they stayed home in 2014, 2016. Are those voters going to be in the electorate in 2018? If those voters are in the electorate, Democrats take the House with 45 seats. If those voters stay home, Democrats take the House, maybe narrowly, maybe they don't. And we need to be hyper-targeting policies that are going to benefit these constituencies.
So you're basically saying that, based on your polling, that this issue of canceling student debt could change the composition, could potentially or theoretically change the composition of the House of Representatives and ensure that it goes to the Democrats.
Absolutely. There is zero doubt in my mind. And you know who this is really popular with? Young women. right? The Democratic Party has seen, this is being called a pink wave, the rise in party affiliation with Democrats among young women, the engagement of young women in running for office and supporting candidates. And this is a policy that overwhelmingly young women support. And again, it's something where the Democratic Party needs to start taking the economic interests and the futures of these voters seriously. And we need to start doing something now, because we are talking a lot about policies that maybe will start benefiting people 10, 15 years from now. The elections are being held now. The decisions being held now. We should start doing policies that directly benefit people immediately, so they know that the Democratic Party is looking out for them.
Well, and I think there's another dimension to this, and Sean McElwee, you and I have had conversations about this. I don't know if we've ever talked about this aspect of it, but I also think it's, and I want your thoughts on it. I also think it's very important for the left and for the Democratic Party and for people in general who want a better country and a better society to start embracing ideas that are, one, bold, two, visionary, and three, reinforce the sense of a community, that we are part of a national community, that we're all in this together. And to me, the idea of canceling student debt does all of those three things. It's bold, it's visionary, but it's a way of saying that young or old, rich or poor, white or black, we all have a common destiny. There is a public good and a public future and a public economy, higher education and other forms of education, because canceling student debt would also address, other kinds of professional training, vocational training, and so on. That all of these forms of training and education should have been a public good all along, that we contribute to one another because everyone benefits economically. So let's do something real and big and exciting for a change. I don't know, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that we would all be better off if we stepped back more often and sort of said, like, what is an economy? What does it do? And what an economy fundamentally is it is a way that we take the resources that we have as a country and the people that we have as a country, and we combine resources and people to build things. And we should ask ourselves, what are the various institutions that we're supporting doing for people? And what is the institution of student debt doing? It is not in any way helping us to better align, people with resources to create things. It is instead an extraction of money and wealth that is coming from the people with the least economic security in this country. And that is not helping us. It is in fact hurting us. It is making people's lives worse. It is a cloud that is over them for their entire lives. It is not letting them be free. It is in fact a chain that they carry. And so we can do things very easily that free up labor and free up resources so that people can reach their full human potential. And at the end of the day, that is what our policy should be rooted in. We should start doing policies that are designed to allow people to reach their full potential. And burdening people with student debt for decades is not doing that.
No, I think that's beautifully said. And before we pivot to something else for just a minute, I guess I will only reiterate that people, once they understand this issue, will need to have an extraordinary attachment to the idea of keeping others in this student debt trap, so much of an attachment to the idea that they're willing to cost the economy more than 1 million jobs and economic growth and a better financial future for everyone, with or without a college education. If you want to pay that big a price in order to keep other human beings from reaching your full potential, I think you ought to give that a serious reconsideration. Sean McElwee, before I let you go, I did want to talk a little bit about an issue that I've covered a little bit, which is drug pricing and drug patents. I've been following that both on the program and in my writing, and you co-authored a piece in The Nation recently on that topic, essentially saying that the government has the ability to step in, and I and others have used the eminent domain analogy, but basically, right now, without new laws, the government could step in when big pharma is charging too much for a life-saving or needed drug, and just say, well, we're manufacturing it, or we're going to let somebody else manufacture it because you're charging too much. Is that correct? Have I summarized your position accurately?
Absolutely. The pharmaceutical industry extracts a profit margin that is larger than any other industry in the economy. And it does this by what is equivalently murder through markets. People die every year in this country because they can't afford pharmaceutical drugs. And the biggest thing that I took away from this when I started polling on this issue is normally when I poll an issue, it looks something like this: urban support, super, super high; suburban support, kind of in the middle; rural support, in the tank, if it's a progressive issue. And what we found with this issue was that support across all geographies was flat, and it was really, really, really high. People love this idea. Trump voters love this idea. And it's a really radical idea. What we basically say is that if there's a life-saving drug, the government should be able to take the patent and it should be able to produce a generic version of it itself. But this really resonates with voters. And if you think about why this would, it makes a lot of sense. Rural voters have been harmed by lack of access to drugs. They've been harmed by the opioid crisis. They've been harmed by the lack of hospital facilities in their areas, and they're really, really mad. And I think that what the Democratic Party can do if it goes fully into the idea of ending pharmaceutical patents is it can disrupt the way that rural voters think of them. Rural voters don't like the Democratic Party that much. They don't like the policies the Democratic Party pursues. But all of a sudden, if a Democratic politician came around and was like, the biggest issue for me is I want to make sure that your drugs for MS is cheaper. I want to make sure your diabetes drugs are cheaper. People will take interest. And if you look at the politicians, folks like Sherrod Brown and Tammy Baldwin, who represent a lot of rural districts and a lot of rural voters and still end up winning elections, they talk a lot about pharmaceutical prices, and they fight the pharmaceutical companies tooth and nail.
So what we have is we have a situation where Democrats once again could do something bold and exciting, and in so doing could strengthen themselves with populations. I think it's I think if we just conclude maybe or talk for a minute about the politics, I think that with the student debt cancellation issue, Democrats could maximize turnout among voters that aren't turning out enough for them and raise enthusiasm. I think maybe with the pharma issue, they could do the same, but could also improve turnout and voters, well, not turnout so much, but could persuade a lot of voters who haven't voted for them maybe in the rural parts of the country. So I don't know, it seems to me that as a combined platform, it would be pretty strong.
Absolutely. And what we did for the piece was we talked to politicians who are in sort of more rural districts. We talked to voters in those districts, but we also talked to politicians in urban districts. And the speaker of my city council, the New York City Council, Corey Johnson, he is the first HIV positive speaker in the council. And for him, drugs that treat HIV and prevent HIV are incredibly expensive. And it's affecting a lot of the LGBT community in New York. And we make the case, look, this is the type of issue that you can get rural voters on board with, and you can get voters in cities on board with. And we would be crazy as a party to not start embracing policies that have that sort of universal support. Because the problem that we saw in the 2016 election is we polarized the electorate based on geography. We had a lot of support among urban voters and a very, very, very low support among rural voters. And when the electorate is polarized by geography, the Democratic Party is at a massive disadvantage because rural voters, whatever you think of the Senate, I do not like it at all, but the Senate is currently the institution where we fight for political power, and that institution overrepresents rural voters. So the Democratic Party needs to think long and hard. How can we get policies that will reduce geographic polarization of the electorate and get it so that we have support among rural voters? We're not going to ever hit probably, 50%. But if we can go from having 30% to 40%, that's going to dramatically change the number of House seats and Senate seats that we can pick up in this cycle.
And we're not going to do it by pretending to be Republicans. Well, I think that strategy has been discredited. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but great research and great work. And Sean McElwee, co-founder of Data for Progress and contributor to The Nation, always great to talk to you. So thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.